Hey everybody, in today's video we're going to be talking about the new firmware updates that are available for all of the Nikon Z mount cameras. Okay, so because I'm going to cover every single camera here and every different update, we're going to fly through some of them and then we're going to do some testing on some of the changes as well. So first of all, Z50. The Z50 is upgrading to version 2.10. This is quite a small update. The biggest change here is that it's adding save focus position. Save focus position is something that was introduced in Z6II and Z7II, and this allows you to save the point at which the camera is focused. So if you're in a situation where you focus at a particular distance to a subject, you turn the camera off. Without this option, and previously what used to happen is that when you turn the camera off, when you turn the camera back on, the focus position would just return to infinity. Whereas now you can actually save where the camera was focused. So if you're working with macro products or a continual setup where you're always focusing in the same place, this obviously saves you an awful lot of time because your camera will always save that focusing position when it's turned on or off. Obviously, if you change lenses, then that's going to be a different story, but it is useful if you're using the same lens in the same setup. But small change there on the Z50. The Nikon Z5 will go to firmware version 1.1. This will also get the save focus position feature. So again, you can save your focus in position. The Z5 also then gets improvements to low light autofocus when you're using low light autofocus mode. Keep in mind that the low light autofocusing mode only works in certain situations. It doesn't work all the time. It doesn't work in AFC, for example. But you will see improved faster focus when you're in that low light autofocusing mode on the Z5. Now when it comes to the Z6 and the Z7, their firmware is being updated to version 3.30. Now again, they will get the save focus position feature, which is useful. And again, this is something that a lot of photographers and videographers have asked for because it means you don't have to continue to reset your focus. So save focus position is something that's now available on Z6, Z7, Z50 and Z5. So it's now across all cameras. And it's interesting that they're slowly starting to add some of the firmware features that were in Z6II and Z7II, now starting to trickle down into some of the older models, Z6, Z7, Z5, Z50. So interesting to see if they add more with further updates down the line. Now, interestingly, in firmware version 3.3 on the Z6, you also get voice memo. Voice memo is something that's been in Nikon cameras for quite a while now. It's been available in a lot of DSLRs in the past, D5, D6, for example. Voice memo is one of those features that you either really need and really use, or you'll never have a use for it whatsoever. So it does depend on what your use case is, but there are a lot of photographers out there who do use this. You just might not be one of them. The key thing to keep in mind though is it's not quite the same as the voice memo feature that's in the D6, for example. And I'll explain why. So the voice memo feature in the D6, you actually have the option to record a voice memo automatically every time you take a picture on the D6. On the Z6, you can't do that. You don't get the automatic voice memo function like you do on the D6. The voice memo function on the Z6, and I want to be very clear here that I don't get them confused. So the voice memo function on the Z6 will allow you to record a voice memo of a shot that you've already taken. So when you're in playback, for example. It depends on what you want from your voice memo feature. Some people would want it to record straight away. So you take a picture, you say the name of the person who's in the picture, for example. That's what you'd use a voice memo for. I speak to a lot of people who shoot for news agencies, who shoot for sports agencies, and it's really easy for them to take someone's picture, add a voice memo to it so that the editor knows who the person in the picture is. With the Z6, you'd have to go into playback, then record the voice memo over the picture that you've already taken. You could then say the person's name or whatever audio clip you want to be attached to the image itself. I think it's a welcome addition. I do know that there will be some of you that will use voice memo in your Z6, but just keep in mind it's a little bit different to what you might be used to from a D6, for example. They do work slightly differently. Now, also interestingly, in the press release, it did say that voice memo would be coming to Z6II in a firmware update down the road. So instantly we know that the Z6IIs are going to get another firmware update. What else is going to be on that firmware update? I think I'm quite happy with this kind of constant flow of firmware updates that Nikon's producing for its cameras. We only had one a couple of months ago for the Z6II and Z7II. Quite clearly, they're in a position where they're adding features over time rather than just a bulk big firmware update, which I know that some people won't like, and I know that some people won't mind that, but the key thing to keep in mind is that clearly at least they're still developing firmware, at least they're adding these firmware updates to these cameras as well. So I know there's a long list of things that people would still want to be added to these cameras, but you have to keep in mind that there's only so much that they can add at one time. When it comes to Z6II and Z7II, they'll be upgraded to firmware version 1.2. Well, the first one for Z6II and Z7II is that you get increased autofocus performance. You also get increased autofocus performance in low light situations, and you also get autofocus detection improvements when you use an external flash. I think the speed light improvement is to do with how the camera's looking at the scene and how photographers use flash. It's quite common for a photographer to underexpose the ambient light, or to shoot in a situation where the subject is backlit, or they're often in a shadow in the foreground, because that's going to be filled in with a light, obviously. So it can mean that the camera can struggle to find a face or an eye. So it's interesting that in this firmware update, they're adding improved detection of faces and eyes in that flash shooting situation. I think this is also useful from a third-party flash point of view, because a lot of photographers who use third-party flashes, they don't always disable apply settings to live view, and that's a really important thing to do, especially when you're using flash, because especially if you're trying to underexpose the ambient light, your picture on the back of the camera is just going to look really dark. So in that situation, the camera just can't see the subject, can't see faces and eyes. So I think there's something going on there with a little bit around third-party flashes, a little bit around just improving detection overall when using a flash system as well. It's not something that I've currently extensively tested, but it is something that I'd want to look at in the future. Now, I think the biggest part of this firmware update for me is the improvement to the tracking boxes or the tracking frames that are used when it comes to face and eye detection and also subject tracking. So what this means is that those boxes are a lot more stickier. They stick to their subjects. They move much more consistently with the movement of the subject and the movement of the camera. One of the things that a lot of Nikon users mentioned previously is that, if you were to quickly move the camera, if the subject was to quickly move, what can happen is the eye tracking box or the face tracking box or the subject tracking box would sometimes lag behind the subject. So your subject might move across the frame and the box would just lag behind the subject. The subject might still be in focus, but the box isn't actually over their eye. So you're none the wiser from a photographer's point of view if the camera is actually focused on the eye or not. And this is something that I have tested, and from the testing that I've done, a very quick test, I appreciate it's not the ultimate real world test, but from the very quick testing that I've done, I do see a massive improvement, especially with subject tracking. When I was editing the subject tracking test, I was literally thinking to myself, wow, this is actually a really impressive achievement. And the next thing that I want to do now is I want to go and practice or shoot with subject tracking with more difficult subjects around wildlife and stuff like that. So that's probably something that I'll pick up in the next couple of weeks. Are we in a situation now where the subject tracking is a lot more useful from a wildlife point of view? That's one of the things I might want to look at. Please do appreciate that it's not the same as like animal eye tracking or animal AF or anything like that. I'm talking about subject tracking, and I've not done any tests currently on the animal IAF and the animal modes. I've only tested the human eye and face tracking, and I've only tested the subject tracking modes. But in both of those modes and in all the tests that I've done, I can see a significant difference in how much stickier the box is to the subject's eye, or how much stickier subject tracking is to the subject as well. So I'm just going to play you some of the tests that I've done comparing Z6II and Z7II at firmware 1.1 and then firmware 2.2 to show you the differences in the tracking frames of the eye tracking and also of the subject tracking as well. So you get an idea of how much better that box sticks to the subject on the back of the screen and in the viewfinder. Also, it's worth noting that some of the differences aren't always visible at full speed, because of how quickly I'm moving and how quickly both boxes are moving, you obviously can't look at both cameras at the same time. So what I've done is I'll play the test at full speed, and then I've also got a small section where I've slowed it down to 10%, just really slow down every frame so that you can really look at where the boxes are placed on each camera at different firmware levels. So you really get an idea of the improvement. I think it's just great to see that we are starting to see improvements in the Z6II and the Z7II's autofocus, just continually pushing them further and further. There's a lot of people who were happy with what they were day one, and it's always interesting to see what performance gains and what improvements can be made to these cameras. I think we're really starting to see the benefit of the dual processors now, especially when you compare that kind of to the original Z6 and Z7. So really interested to see what other firmware updates are on the way. Like it said, there's going to be another firmware update for Z6, which includes the voice memo feature. So there's, you know, they're going to add other things to that as well. And also really interested to see what they do with other firmware updates with other cameras. This is obviously the first update for a lot of the other Z mount cameras for a long time. So I think it'd be really nice every 1 or 2 months if there's this rolling collection of firmware updates for the cameras, just adding these new features. That's something that I know that a lot of you guys want as well. So hopefully that's the case. I don't know, but hopefully that is the case going forward. But I'm really excited about what some of those new features are going to be, and especially really excited about what we can really get out of the Z6II and the Z7II. Keep in mind that on Z6II and Z7II, this is still technically a small update because we're still at version 1.2. We haven't got to version 2 or version 3. And when we look back at Z6 and Z7, they really escalated and really jumped to another level of performance when they went to version 2 and version 3. So what are we going to see there? We're going to see newer focusing modes. Are we going to see much improved performance? Really interested to see what things we can see with different firmware updates. So I hope you found this quick look at the collection of firmware updates for the new Z mount cameras useful. My biggest advice to you is update your camera. So pretty much every Z mount camera has a firmware update. So go and update your firmware. Make sure that your cameras are up to date. It's always worthwhile doing for new features, bug fixes, and so on. So just keep in mind that it's definitely worth doing. If you did find this video useful, then please do give it a like. That helps me in just making more people see this video. And as always, thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.